In 1900, an inventor by the name of Bell invented the telephone in Aquitanian Floridae. This invention saw wide and almost immediate adoption, revolutionizing communication forever. In July of the new century, Volkish explorers were the first to reach the North Pole, the flag of the Volksreich proudly flying in the icy wastes. Meanwhile, in Aquitania, a poor harvest due to nearby fields affected by industrial development caused the price of bread and other foodstuffs to skyrocket. Hungry, angry people flooded the streets from Normandy to Gibraltar. In response to this, Emperor Philippe VIII Croylan passed a set of price controls on bread and other essentials. This alleviated the plight of the starving masses, at least for a while, until it set off a chain of events that would come to unfold over the course of the next 3 months. The bakers who turned the grain and flour into bread were siphoning funds due to the price controls, and as such slashed the price by which they would purchase grain from the farmers. Many of the farmers refused to sell, and so the urban centers began to go hungry once more. Philippe VIII, terrified of the prospect of being the one to fail his bloodline, sent the army into the countryside to force the farmers to sell, based on prices dictated by government bureaucrats. And so they were forced to sell at a loss, to people who were forced to sell at a loss, to people whose demand for bread was essentially infinite, all kept moving under the threat of government force. This was unsustainable, and soon this bad harvest ran out. The factories ground to a halt, and the cities burned, filled to the bursting point with destitute, desperate people. Desperate themselves, the army raided the countryside on behalf of the crown, and ravaged farms and homesteads looking for any hoarded grain. Philippe VIII lifted the price controls, though of course it was too late. Aquitania had descended into chaos. The north was gripped by various rebel groups, and as such the crown and the aristocratic government it headed had to flee to the Iberian territories, setting up their seat of power in Burgos. However, on the 3rd of July 1901, reactionary rebels comprised of church-sponsored bakers' guilds and farmers toppled the crown government, hanged Philippe VIII, enforced their demands, and formed a new government called the Burgos Republican Government. This government made sweeping allowances for Catholic clergy and banned the practice of a wide array of other religions. Regardless, the Aquitanian Civil War was still raging, as the rest of Europe looked on in horror. Philippe VIII's uncle, Raphael Croylan, escaped to Russia and declared himself the heir of the vacant Aquitanian imperial throne. His loyalist forces became known across the continent for their brutality, and in the pursuit of their goal there was an atmosphere of what could only be called bloodlust. Meanwhile, this revolution, in a great power, sent shockwaves across Europe and the world, leaving polite society to hope that other rebel groups would not be emboldened by their success. On the 31st of August, 1901, the short-lived Burgos Republican government was undone. Corruption and intrigue between the nascent political parties led to violence, causing Burgos to burn to the ground. The Civil War would continue to grind up countless soldiers for 1,000 causes, until April 3, 1903, when the Aquitanian anarcho-liberal faction, calling itself the Devant le Quartier, captured a large shipment of Russian weaponry meant for Raphael's loyalist forces, via robbing the train the shipment was being transported on. This allowed the Devant to systematically defeat the other factions in the north and make a final push into Iberia, bringing it under their control. And so their revolution was successful, and they hoisted their own flag, a red crescent in a white circle on a red field, representing their ideals that the government should be a night watchman state, and the blood spilled that was necessary to make it so. They established the seat of their government in the business sector of the city of Mont-de-Marsan, and elected a president they called the Executive Vanguard, Executive Yannick Gaillot, until recently the owner of the Aquitanian coal monopoly, Gaillot Coal. They codified a wide number of non-laws, re-establishing relations with the Republic of Colombia as well as essentially unfettering business from the control of any state entity. Most significantly, they maintained a voluntary army, known as the Night Watchmen, comprised of well-trained soldiers from a wide variety of private sources, namely a laundry list of Aquitanian businesses, though there were some private citizens who found combat invigorating. Meanwhile, Raphael changed his paths in life and became a general in Tsar Alexander's Russian army. These sudden and rapid personality changes taking place in the Aquitanian halls of power led to further anxiety throughout the rest of Europe. By August, the Night Watchman state had made further inroads into Africa, responding to the desire of domestic business for greater access to African resources, and thusly conflicting with the borders of Africa. Around May of 1903, the diplomatic corps of the Volksreich began to fall behind that of other countries, leading to Alençon slipping from the sphere of the Volksreich, resuming control of its own affairs. On October 29th, wishing to project strength to the rest of Europe, as well as take advantage of the fact that the dual alliance was no more, Kaiser Erhard VII declared war on the Russian Empire for the region of Ostpreußen in order to connect the estranged region of Latvia to the rest of Volkish territory. It was a swift war, as the Kaiser was violent in his direct commanding of his generals, and Russia had lost its closest ally. So, on March 9, 1904, St. Petersburg was occupied and Ostpreußen was surrendered to the Volksreich. Tsar Alexander began his habit of drinking that day. It was the fastest any major power had yet been defeated, though it is worth noting that General Raphael Croillon proved his military genius in that war, as units under his command were the only ones to make the Volkish army suffer any losses. Meanwhile, many of the Volkish soldiers stationed on the Eastern Front were relocated to the Aquitanian border, in order to take advantage of any future instability they might experience. Kaiser Erhard VII revealed himself here to be a bloodthirsty man, and indeed a relatively unhinged mind to be wearing the crown. Meanwhile, due to the relative diplomatic silence coming from the Magyarország, Kaiser Erhard VII believed they were up to something, and so the Volksreich decided to promote military buildup along the border there too, expecting a war of containment against the oil-rich behemoth to break out. This seemed like paranoia to most, though it turned out that the Volksreich was right to worry, as the Magyarország, under Emperor Kelemen V Vancouver, allied with two other great powers, the Ming Empire under Emperor Shuli, and the Aksu Empire under Khan Abdullah Sarangorel, declared the Magyar War of Volkish Containment on the 24th of January 1905. It turned out that a war of containment was afoot after all, just not how the Kaiser had thought. Two divisions set off for the Magyar capital of Székesfehérvár, which was simply called Balaton by the Volkish for the lake that was to its south. There were two fronts, the southeast and southwest. The southeast was the mainland and the southwest was the long-held Magyar enclave of Turin, which was a holdover from when they held most of Italy in the Middle Ages. Erhard VII entered this conflict with a self-aggrandizing frame of mind, and wished not only to defeat the Magyar alliance, but to embarrass them. As Volkish infantry charged over the border and began to terrorize a variety of Magyar towns, they were met with a terrible sight. Thousands of Magyar tanks, supported by an endless horde of Ming infantry, and all supported by swift Aksu cavalry. The Magyar alliance had learned from the 20 Years' War against Russia, and so now had taught themselves how to coordinate attacks and organize precise and overwhelming strikes against their enemies. On the 11th of May 1905, the war ended in a humiliating defeat, Stettin falling to the invading force, humbling the Volksreich. The Treaty of Győr leveled the terrible price of peace squarely at the Volksreich. It cut the Volkish military in half and ceded the region of Slovakia to the Magyarország. Not only had this victory contained the Volksreich and its growth, but it had also replaced the spot of the world's premier alliance, once occupied by the Dual Alliance, with this Magyar alliance, now known as the 30th Parallel League, for the fact that all members sat along 30 degrees north latitude. Colloquially, many called this alliance the Parallel League or the 3PL. Kaiser Erhard, unable to stand the shame of defeat, boarded a boat with a small crew and was never seen again, allowing his son, Erhard VIII von Formbach, to ascend to the throne. The emergence of the 3PL would prompt the Volksreich to start forging its own alliances, relying on fellow great powers to assure greater security. By 1906, the island-based great powers of Ireland and Japan joined in alliances with the Volksreich, though it wasn't as united or unilateral as the 3PL was. It was in this way that Europe would see 30 years of peace, the 3PL content to see the Volksreich hedging its bets and afraid to take risks, essentially hemmed in and sidelined. The same was also true of anarcho-liberal Aquitania, which at this stage in its life as a new economic system allowed it to focus on outcompeting foreign companies as much as possible, replacing a given country's domestic goods with something produced on the other side of the continent. The 3PL, meanwhile, would set the tone for global geopolitics, and it would likely have remained unchallenged had the course of history not found itself flowing right through the heart of the Volksreich. The Great War theorists waited with bated breath for their dire day, which seemed to never come. At least, not yet. Amidst all this chaos, in the tiny nation of Alençon, a small cabal of socialists saw how injustice was met with injustice in their neighbor right over the border, and they founded the first communist party, the Alençon Workers faction. For these 30 years of peace, the Alençon Workers faction would pen articles and author theory which resonated with few, but were nonetheless disseminated to every corner of literate Europe. As the cracks in this new order began to show, as they always do, the seeds of Marxist thought would find purchase there, germinating in the dark, smoky corners of cafes and the fetid factory floors alike.